Hello, this is a video going over some improvisational theory for Sweet Georgia Brown on the bass. This isn't going to cover everything, and there are some assumptions that I'm probably making here that you understand some basic major scales or just how to find your notes. There is tablature here on the PDF as a way to kind of help speed track and demo some things. I know reading is not always the strongest thing for every fingerboard musician, whether it's guitar or electric bass. But I think it's important that you can play it, thus why the tab is here. But I don't answer every question, so there's going to be some level of you're going to have to work some things out beyond this. This isn't every answer you're going to need. But that said, let me go through what I think is important to come up with some successful improv and some simple ideas for Sweet Georgia Brown. Page 1 of the PDF, I have the major and minor and mixed Lydian scales, and this represents the basic home bass starting points for all the chords and the key center of the song. There's tab here. This is a fingering you can use, so some of you may be familiar with this already, the closed major scale fingering. What's tricky sometimes about this is you might know this shape and say this is the major scale. When it comes to notation reading, you actually probably know it from reading music in the lower positions and not necessarily in the middle of the fingerboard. So the tab is here to kind of help you sort out some common shapes you can use in an attempt to memorize these patterns and try to put them into movement. So step one, let's go through the scales we have here. There's the A flat major scale in this closed pattern, up and down. And then there's the A flat major 7th arpeggio. These are the four notes of the A flat major 7 chord, which is a shape that is within your major scale. You can also play up to the octave, which is the high A flat, and back down. The next scale is F natural minor, also called F Aeolian if you're going through theory. F natural minor is this. And the minor 7th is, or if you do the octave. F Mixolydian, F 7th, this is for the first opening chord of Sweet Georgia Brown. It's essentially a major scale, but the 7th note of the scale is flatted. So if you know your major scale patterns, making some of these other shapes isn't actually that much harder to make the adjustment. F Mixolydian. F 7th arpeggio. And then over a string, the same exact pattern is B flat Mixolydian. And then B flat 7th arpeggio. And then if I go to the middle of the fingerboard here, E flat 6th fret, I can do E flat Mixolydian. And then the E flat 7th arpeggio. This is a little awkward again because if you're reading music, the tendency is to be down low, and therefore the E flat scale Mixolydian or major would be coming off of the lower position and shifting down, as opposed to jumping to the middle of the neck. This is an easier way to memorize it, but it might be harder to make that flow with patterns you're familiar with. So going into the second page of the PDF, we have E flat Mixolydian, and that's our final scale shape. And I point out here is that you have essentially 4 bars of each scale to use in an improv. So for example, on the opening 4 bars, it just says F 7th, and F Mixolydian go together. Next 4 bars, B flat 7th, B flat Mixolydian, done. Same for E flat. The last line, it says, has a couple different chords thrown in there. A flat major 7th, B flat minor, E flat 7th, A flat major 7th, and then G minor 7 flat 5, C 7th. That's a lot of chord mumbo jumbo if you're not used to doing improv jazz stuff. Long story short, all those chords fit within the A flat major scale. So you can abbreviate the process and just say, here is one scale to rule them all for right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit play. I'm using Real Pro off my iPad, so the sound quality is not amazing here for the backing track, but you'll still be audible enough. I'm going to play the first half of the tune with those chords, and I'm going to just play the scales up and down with each of those 4-bar groupings. I'm not doing anything in particular improv-wise. I'm just sort of playing it up and down. But I'm going to change with each chord to the new matching scale. For example, this is at tempo for all states. Here's B flat. E flat. And then A flat major. So right there, you can hear how those sounds go together, and it feels like it's all lining up, especially if you can do the scales in the right 4-bar groupings. If I was to pick a different scale than what's written there, it might not necessarily sound like horrific or something, but you might notice that it feels like it's not centered, like they're not lining up perfectly. That thing is really important. In theory, we call chord scale theory. That the chord and the scale match. This isn't the only way to do improv, but it's a big cornerstone of figuring out the technical aspects of improvisation. So page 3. If you're comfortable with these scales over the chord changes, you can try to develop small motifs with the different scales. Start with a melody fragment, think more about the rhythm and less about the correct note combination. So what I mean from that is to think more about the rhythm you're going to use. So the opening rhythm pattern here is the same rhythm from the first 2 bars of the melody. So that first part, I'm using that same rhythm, but I'm just applying them to different notes in the scale. And without going any further as far as technique goes, I'm literally just taking those notes in the Yahtzee cup and just throwing them out with rhythm. So what I've written down here is me using one motif and putting it through those same 16 bars and the same 4-bar groupings of those same scales. What you'll notice is it will sound pleasant, but it gets kind of stale quickly because you get used to the rhythm motifs. Even though the notes are changing and it sounds pleasant enough as it changes through those chords, it also sort of feels like it gets old relatively quickly, at least halfway through it. It's like, okay, I get it. But let me demonstrate. Here's the backing track again, and here's the written motif improv thing on page 3. I'll try to follow the tab here. So again, it works, but you can tell how it sort of stagnates. It doesn't go anywhere. A key feature of jazz improv, and this is true I guess with most solos, but especially in jazz improv, has to sort of keep developing and keep moving and changing and growing into something. So the next page of the PDF, I have written, sorry, it says this is technically correct, but obviously repetitive. It's referring to the previous one we were just talking about. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking the same motif and I'm adding in little bits of scale runs, meaning off of my mode or my scale, F Mixolydian or whatever measure I'm on, I'm just starting at any given pitch and just moving up or down, creating little simple 8th note scale runs. Again, you can start anywhere in these scales and go up and down. So your ability to play those scales from page 1 is going to be super important to improv through this tune. So you're going to want to be able to have those scale shapes down and then know where you want to put your left hand for those scale shapes. And just as a sidebar here, if you feel like you want to write something out and be prepared for all states and have like some written licks, solo ideas, and you're not technically improving every single detail, that's actually okay. The all states here, I think, really prefer that you're prepared as opposed to that you're going to just intuit from the sky some mind-blowing improvisation. So if you feel more comfortable writing something down, I would strongly recommend that you do that. And you can actually, get ahead of the game and have something you can practice and memorize or get comfortable doing, as opposed to feeling like you have to improvise every single detail along the way. So that said, here is the amended version of that motif, now with some different scale runs. And you'll notice it sounds a lot more musical all of a sudden. Again, there's always more, but at least this is now phase 2. So here's my backing track. So in that mode, it sounds more musical all of a sudden and more like an improv solo. So going on to the next page of the PDF, just going to read some of my text here. Second solo pass sounds better, but still has a limited number of options. What I mean by that is we're using one motif from that original melody, and I'm just overlaying scale runs with it. To do more, or to try to make it feel like it's going to the next level, there are some different things you can add. It doesn't have to be all of these things, but these are some ideas to think about. You could add a second octave to the scale, meaning if you've memorized the scale shape in one spot, you could take that pattern and find the next octave of F and do that thing. Memorize other melody motifs. So if I've got the first part, that was the first motif we're using was this first melody pattern. I use the next part. I could use that motif. But you could use other rhythm fragments from other parts of the melody. That's what I mean there. Create new motifs, patterns from the scale. So again, you could use those scale runs, but try to come up with your own ideas. So instead of just playing a simple scale run here off my F Mixolydian grouping, I could come up with some different. And feel free to improvise or write out and compose some ideas from that. Or using the chords arpeggio to isolate stronger melodic lines. This one I want to kind of camp on for a minute just to talk about, because this really gets us into building a walking bass line, which is super important. But using the chords arpeggio back to the first page was that 4-note chord combination. So something that's provided for you in the All States packet is a written bass line etude, which is important to learn because you have to memorize that or be able to read and play it for all states. But I do feel like it glosses over a fundamental important skill as a bass player is being able to walk a bass line. This is like really, really important. So I've written on this PDF an example walking bass line, just my own. When I talked about using the chords arpeggio to isolate stronger melodic lines, the most obvious and basic function on our instrument is creating a walking bass line. The most important thing to notice is when we're looking at the walking line is it's within the scales we talked about, but more importantly on beat 1 there is a strong chord tone, meaning one of those arpeggiated notes. So if I look at here walking bass line, what's labeled as measure 74, F, the root, is on beat 1. The next beat 1 is C. That was the fifth of the chord of the arpeggio, fifth note of the scale, depending how adept you are with theory conversation. F is the root of that chord, and E flat is called the flatted seventh of that chord. Now, even if you don't understand that number part, if you were to go back to the first page, you would notice that all the beat 1 note choices are one of the notes from that arpeggio grouping for whatever scale or chord we're talking about. It's important to be able to build a walking bass line with that thing on beat 1 being the most important choice, getting those notes on beat 1. Once you develop an ear for that aspect of a walking bass line, it's not going to be too much harder to then add other rhythm to spice it up, which I'll demonstrate in a second. So first thing, I'm going to play this walking bass line that I wrote out here. Here's my backing track. There, I'll biff one note because I'm trying to pay attention to the tab super hard as I'm reading this. But that's a walking bass line here. So what I'm going to do now is take liberty with the walking bass line, add rhythm. So essentially, I'm going to take what would be the contour of the bass line, meaning here is, for example, F, and I'm walking up or going up to an F. See that? Like it's going upwards. So here I've got pretty much the same notes. I'm going on this low F, I'm going up to F. I'm just adding in eighth notes. Now you will notice that the bass line does skip a little bit around, so it's not as linear or direct. Here it's basically going up stepwise in a scale, as you can see. And here it has a little bit jumping around, C, E flat, D. So it's like jumping, skipping a musical third intervallically, but it's jumping up and then going back down. So there's a little bit of extra jumping around to make the eighth note rhythms work. But for the most part, those note choices are also within the scale. One thing you'll notice is that there's extra accidentals, chromatic passing notes. This is also very common in a improvised jazz solo. I don't want to get too much stuff crammed in this video, so it feels like it's overwhelming. But there is use of chromatics to connect the dots between different parts of the scale or other chord tones. You can just sort of accept that for what it is right now if you feel like that's just another thing to juggle that you don't want to get wrapped up in. I'd say for most good bass solos, the most important thing is the clarity and good kind of rhythm, motif, and phrasing ideas. The fact that you don't use a lot of chromatic notes or just don't want to use them at all and stay within the scale grouping, that is like way bottom of the list of things to be worried about. The most important thing is that as you're soloing, you can still outline the form of the tune and keep time. That's probably one of the most unfair things about a bass solo, is that you're still expected to keep time while you solo. So the sacrifice is to keep better time, you might have to let go of other cool, fancy melodic things that other instruments, say your saxophonist or trumpet player or piano player, can do, because they have you as a bass player to lean on to provide time. When you're soloing as a bassist, you kind of have to keep time going. So all that said, here is the same walking bass line, but now adjusted with the use of rhythm and some melodic skipping within the scale. But if you were to compare parts of this solo that I'm about to play for you, it has the same kind of up and down shape movement as the walking bass line. Or sometimes I like to say this is essentially a walking bass line on steroids. You're doing the same process as a walking bass line, where you're looking for strong chord tones as the beginning or ending of phrases, just like from the arpeggio we were talking about before. But now you're just gussing it up with extra rhythm. Hopefully I can read the tab correctly and not So that is a amended version of the walking bass line with added rhythm. The only thing I don't necessarily love about the way that I tabbed it is this little jump here. But it does work because you have an eighth rest, so it's okay. But if you were to read it, if you're good at reading, you could change that. And and that would be okay. It's just kind of up to what you feel comfortable with. The important thing is that you can see these new motifs and rhythm ideas as it relates to the previous build, so the walking bass line, or compared to my chord scale theory we were just briefly going over, and the shapes. More than likely, if you're a bass player auditioning on all states, you're probably more comfortable with the fingerboard pattern stuff. That's at least typical, is the shape thing is easier to memorize than necessarily reading a lot of this stuff, which is why I've put everything in tab for all the different etude examples and stuff. But as far as the improv goes, this is just the first half of the form is what I've written these lines for, and you'll have to come up with the second half of the form. I would say if you're using some of these patterns directly from the etude, just as an FYI, I am sharing this with every teacher in the state of Maine so that they are aware that this playlist exists and that they can share this with you. So if you come in playing this verbatim, that might knock you some points. But don't feel bad if you want to use some of my ideas as like a starter to sketching out some patterns and getting some things going. I think that'd be super important. And don't feel bad to use some of these ideas to get you moving if you need to copy some things just to wrap your head around some of the improv concepts. I think that's why this is here. But I wouldn't show up playing the first half of this thing note for note. I would try to do your own thing. That said, this is a quick introductory blast on how to improv over Sweet Georgia Brown. This is on my website, the PDFs for this, and this YouTube playlist is a link you're going to have, obviously. If you have any questions, you don't have to hesitate to email me. My email's on the website, duaneedwards.info. You can also ask your band director. They might be able to give you some pointers as well. But good. There you go.